Oi, boa tarde a todo mundo. Meu nome é Rafael Groman, eu sou diretor científico da COMPÓS, Associação Brasileira dos Programas de Pós-Graduação em Comunicação. E hoje você está em mais um Esquenta COMPÓS, em plena sexta-feira, um happy hour delicioso, mais debates importantíssimos para a pesquisa em comunicação no Brasil e no mundo. Hoje temos aqui um bate-papo com a professora Catherine Steele, da Universidade de Maryland, que será apresentada daqui a pouco, sobre o seu novo livro em relação ao feminismo negro digital. E para ser a grande debatedora, provocadora, comentadora desta tarde de sexta-feira, eu chamo ao palco a professora Fernanda Carrera, que é professora da Escola de Comunicação da UFRJ, onde é coordenadora do curso de Publicidade, e professora do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Comunicação da UF, Universidade Federal Fluminense, em que é líder do grupo de pesquisa LID, Laboratório de Identidades Digitais e Diversidade da UFRJ, e doutora em comunicação também pela UF, pesquisa raça, gênero e interseccionalidade na comunicação e culturas digitais. E se posso dar um spoiler, em breve ela publicará como organizadora um dossiê inteirinho sobre interseccionalidade e plataformas digitais. Fernanda, boa tarde, muito obrigado por ter aceito esse convite. Arrase.
Boa tarde, Rafael. É um prazer enorme estar aqui. Eu quero agradecer realmente a toda a equipe da COMPÓS pelo convite para compor o Esquenta COMPÓS com a Catherine, falando sobre feminismo negro e ambiente digital, que é meu escopo de pesquisa de fato. Catherine, com esse livro Digital Black Feminism, tem um trabalho muito próximo, de contribuição muito forte para a minha pesquisa, né, interseccionalidades, cultura digital, assim como eu acho que de muitas pessoas que fazem parte desse grupo de pesquisadores aqui no Brasil, tanto no LID, que eu coordeno, mas também em outras áreas, entendendo aí feminismo negro digital e todos os seus atravessamentos. Então, antes da apresentação formal, eu vou avisar a audiência que a Catherine fará uma apresentação de 30 minutos, mais ou menos, sobre o livro. Toda a nossa conversa aqui vai ser em inglês, com a legenda automática aí do YouTube. E aí a gente vai deixar também disponível o vídeo no canal da COMPÓS. Então, Catherine vai fazer um apanhado sobre a proposta do livro, que ela traz de resultado da sua pesquisa, e depois a gente abre para perguntas que podem ser feitas no chat do YouTube. Vocês podem fazer as perguntas em inglês ou em português, e a gente traduz aqui rapidinho para ela, né? A gente tem uma equipe aqui enorme por trás, que é composta por Rafael Groma. Eu peço que vocês sejam simples nas perguntas para ajudar os colegas, principalmente aqueles que não têm esse inglês todo, que sou eu, né? Então, eu já chamo aqui a Catherine para a tela e a gente faz as apresentações formais. Hi again, Catherine. Again, thank you so much for being here with us. You have a powerful book to present for us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I read with intense interest because the book is a claim, I think, for a change in communication studies, technology studies, and so on. Thank you for that. So I will present you and your background for the audience doing this formal presentation.
Okay.
And then you can talk about digital Black feminism, the book, your motivation, the major argument, and of course, everything that you want to say about your work. Yeah. And then we can open for some questions. Okay?
Sounds great.
Hi, everyone. My name is Fernanda Carrera. I'm professor in communication at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And today here in Esquenta COMPÓS, or the warm-up for the major congress of the National Association of Graduate Programs in Communication here in Brazil, we are receiving Catherine Steele, the author of Digital Black Feminism, a book released in 2021, very recent and fresh. Catherine is assistant professor of communication at the University of Maryland, College Park, where she directs the Black Communication and Technology Lab. Her research focuses on race, gender, and media, with a specific emphasis on Black culture and discourse and digital communication. She studies representations of marginalized communities in the media and how groups resist oppression and practice joy using online technology to create spaces of community. And she has a large contribution to communication and technology studies, like the journal articles Black Feminist Pleasure on TikTok, an ode to Hurston's characteristics of Negro expression in women's studies in communication. The article, When the Black Lives That Matter Are Not Our Own, Digital Black Feminism and a Dialectic of Self and Community in Feminist Media Studies. Joy is resistance. Amen. Amen for that. Resilience and reinvention of Black oral culture across platforms online with Jessica Lu in Information Communication and Society. And she wrote some book chapters to Defying Death, Black Joy as Resistance Online in Networked Self, Birth, Death, and Life, organized by Zizi Papacharisi, Signifying Beaching and Blogging, Black Women and Resistance Discourse Online in the Intersectional Internet, organized by Sophia Noble and B Times, and the intersection of race multiplicity and holism with online social media in Women of Color Navigating Mentoring Relationships, Critical Examinations. So after this presentation, I'm very pleased to talk to you, Catherine. Thank you, and we are so excited to listen more about your work and about your research. After Catherine's talk, we can open for some questions. I have myself some questions that I'm anxious to do. So thank you again, and you have the word.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen with you all, and let me make sure that everyone can see. Yeah, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to move through slides and things rather quickly because, as I was just saying before we started, I am always so much more interested in the conversation part. I think it's always more generative for everyone to be in dialogue and to ask questions and to talk things through. But I'm just so genuinely happy and thrilled and grateful to be with you and to talk a little bit about this book. I'm always excited to find out ways that the work can be useful for someone, that whatever I was intending to do, that can be taken up, but also that it can be taken up in a plethora of ways that I didn't set out to do. And so I always enjoy the conversation in that way and the ability to talk through these ideas with you. I'll spend just a short time walking through some pieces of the book rather than kind of laying out every part. The way that I like to think about the book is through past, present, and future. Those are, through a timeline of sorts. And so I'll kind of walk through that timeline a bit. But I'll begin by just saying that Digital Black Feminism, for me, is a book about Black women. I begin my first introductory chapter by saying that so many of the books that we read about technology are about white men, whether or not they explicitly say it. So many of the books and writings that happen about feminism are about white women. And so many of the books about race that we read, particularly in the US, are about Black men. And so I wanted to very intentionally write about Black women. And I wanted to write a book about Black women that did a couple of things, that intentionally rewrote and reframed the history of technology, acknowledging the fact that history has intentionally been written in a way to keep Black women out. Not that Black women weren't present in the makings of technology, but that our history has been written such that we have intentionally and willfully neglected Black women's presence there. So the book attempts to undo some of that, to unpack some of that, to take a serious look at the past with the intention of moving to a place where we have a more fruitful conversation about our past, yes, but also our present and our future. And so I begin that by asking a question, or a question that prompts this for me is, what is technology itself? And when I'm in the longer version of this talk, sometimes I'll have folks kind of write that out and we'll talk it through, but I'll ask you to just think about that. When you hear the term technology, what are the first ideas that come to mind? What are the first images that come to mind? Who are the people that come to mind? And when we also think of technology, how do we come to think about who and what constitutes technological expertise? Is it through what we're taught in schools, or the movies or films that we watch, the books that we read? Who do we place in positions of authority to tell us more about our lives and our technologies? And as we do that, it really makes me wonder how we get to think about this term expert and expertise. And what I found in my own research and in my own life experience is that even as a Black woman, so much of my assumptions about who had expertise as it related to technology were divorced from who I was raised to be, and the community I was around, until I began to understand that all of these definitions of technology were really rooted in an intentional attempt to divorce the skill, labor, and expertise of Black women in the US from this practice or this separate idea of what technology was. We did really intentional work in our country, in the US, to make labor and play separate, to make domesticity and scientific understanding separate. And in doing that, what we did was actually take away not the work of technology, not the ingenuity of technology, but the story of technology from the folks who are responsible for creating and sustaining the real foundation of what our technological futures look like. A student pointed out to me the other day as I was talking through these ideas that my book does a lot of what they call operationalizing, right? That I spend a lot of time trying to figure out what words mean. And I give credit to one of my professors in graduate school 10 years ago who made us do this for an entire semester. All we did was operationalize terms. It was very annoying at the time, but I guess the habit stuck, because I do think that it really is incumbent upon us as scholars to be very clear about what we're saying and to intentionally put forward the arguments that we're making with the idea that the words that we say matter, that these aren't inadvertent thing. They're not inadvertent ways that we're left out of the story, that they're very concretely intentional. And I always reference back a quote from Patricia Hill Collins, where she says, "The shadow obscuring a complex Black woman's intellectual tradition is neither accidental nor benign." And so what I would suggest is the undoing of that will not happen on accident. It will be intentional. It will be through our act of saying, no, we are going to think about this differently. For the history of the U.S., which is a rather short history, all things considered, in the world, 300 years-ish or so, the narrative that has followed that our history has been one of efficiency and progress, right? That the U.S. is one of efficiency and progress. And that efficiency and progress, that narrative, that master narrative that's been constructed, has really done so in a way to remove marginalized populations' lives and experiences from the story, even though it's the marginalized folks in our country that are responsible for building the possibilities of that U.S. efficiency and progress. But without a written record that is kept and maintained by those marginalized communities, what I found in the book is we actually have to look between the lines of the historical record to see the spaces where those technologies happen. And I do that in the text by trying to locate a space within our US history where Black women were purveyors of technology outside of the eye of the dominant group, where technologies were used exclusively on and for Black women, and where Black women were sought after and respected for their expertise. There aren't a lot of spaces where that's the case, quite frankly. So I begin with that space, or I begin with the notion that we need that space, because I think it's the only way for us to understand and appreciate Black women's expertise elsewhere, is by first looking at a place that centers Black women, by first drawing our attention to that space, first removing the blinders and the lenses that have caused us to remove that history, to remove Black women from our concept of technology. We have to undo this perceived and assumed deficiency and ineptitude that society has bestowed on Black women, which is weird because inexplicably, while we've been deemed deficient and not capable, we've also been layered with this notion of magic, right? Where it removes the possibilities of skill and expertise and somehow becomes the supernatural force by which we get things done. So to do that, the space, the actual physical space that I name, is the beauty shop, the Black women's beauty shop. And I built this as kind of an analytic in order to understand what I call a Black feminist technoculture. Black feminist technoculture, this premise is really built around Brock's notion of Black cyber culture, where he describes Black cyber culture as a digital practice and artifact informed by Black aesthetics. He's doing this to argue against a perceived white cyber culture. And what I would say is that if Black cyber culture, if this critical interjection on the part of Andre Brock asks us to consider how Black folks' unique experiences are transposed into their relationships with technology, it's a really valid starting point. But I build on this logic in order to say that Black feminism is uniquely suited to undercut the reach and the power of white men's cyberculture, because Black women's experience with oppression and resistance shapes our ability to understand and use communication technologies, both analog and digital. And if white technoculture is built on white ideology, patriarchy, misogyny, Black feminist technoculture is its undoing. So I centralize this idea of a Black feminist technoculture without comparison to whiteness, without comparison to masculinity, in order to shed the boxes that patriarchy and white supremacy are typically used to constrict our potential. So within this beauty shop, I'll just give you a few ways that I think the beauty shop serves as a really useful metaphor for us to really understand Black feminist technoculture. I think the first way is that we think through how the beauty shop reminds us about something about Black feminism that is sometimes taken for granted, and that is that it's not a reaction to white feminism. Right? Black feminism predates white feminism. Toni Morrison writes about this and says, when Black women had nothing to fall back on, not maleness, not whiteness, not ladyhood, nothing, out of a profound desolation of our reality, we have invented ourselves. So unlike the history of white suffragists in the US who had to prove their strength and their viability in a world of men, Black women had already inherently proven those strengths, both physical and psychological. So our feminism begins with a different premise. It begins with a different goal, with a different objective. And frankly, it begins before a time where it's necessary to prove oneself in a room full of men, right? That baptism of fire had already existed and we had emerged intact. So Black feminism existed in the early Americas through insurgent actions on the part of enslaved women who were simultaneously fighting white slaveholders for their freedom while caring and attending to their families. They were asserting agency over their bodies and their minds. They were fighting white supremacy through their love of each other. I see all of this organized in this premise of the beauty shop, right? Because this is a place that at its core is centralizing Black women's experience without comparison to white women's. It doesn't exist to be reactive to it, rather to sustain Black women within their own space. And I also like this notion of the beauty shop because it gives us another wonderful metaphor about our hair, right? The complexity of our hair, the beauty of our hair, but also our hair and our hair care as a technology itself. Things like braids and weaves, have long histories. They have complex ideas, but they are in fact a technology or a tool with a rule structure, not unlike that of an algorithm. Andrea Rose Clark gives us this really fantastic way of thinking about braiding as technology. And I'll put the quote up on the screen as I read it to you. Design and fabrication tools perform aesthetic gestures based preset commands and algorithms. The execution and repetition of a series of procedures produces patterns we see as braids. I won't read the whole thing. You can go on to come back to this. But what Clark is really suggesting to us is that this is far more than some superfluous thing that we do for fun, right? That braiding is in fact a technology. It is a sophisticated calculation. There are criteria by which we judge whether or not it's successful. There are multiple points in this braiding session where we make decisions based on what happened before. And there are these seemingly intuitive decisions, as she calls them, that actually are evolving in a manner that's akin to precise laser burning and etching onto material. There is mapping, there is preparation, there is in this act of plating. Natrice Gaskins, artist, scholar, writer, talks about this as well, suggesting that the simplicity of the end result doesn't always tell the story of how interwoven and intricate the patterns are, that it's actually the complexity that arises out of the simplicity, right? That making something look easy does not in fact mean that it's easy. And so I love this as a metaphor for what Black women are doing online, for how we are utilizing the skill sets that we already have access to do things that are sustaining for ourselves in these spaces. There's just two other ways that I think the beauty shop functions for us and translates from this analog space into digital space. The third way is when we think about the entrepreneurship that's necessary to run a beauty shop, right? That it requires not only a skill set in washing or braiding or straightening or curling hair, it requires one to run a business, right? To actually understand the mechanics of running a business, to do marketing, to do branding, to do all the things necessary to make sure that folks are continually coming into the shop, that money is made, that money is spent in proper ways to keep the shop sustaining. And what's really brilliant about this is that Black women in US context were doing this in beauty shops, and I would wager everywhere, diasporically, have been doing this everywhere without the formal structures that typically support businesses. Right? Not having access to the small business loans and the business training and the, and the apprenticeship and all of these formal structures that other folks get to tap into in order to build their businesses. And the very same thing is true online. When we look at the blogosphere, when we look at the ways that Black women online have set up their online spaces in ways to not only develop a skill that is useful to their readers or to their followers, but that is financially beneficial for themselves. I walk through the process of Black women, as I argue, being the first influencers, being the folks who have kind of created influencer culture. It's become something quite different in that time, but are really responsible for this notion of out of nothing, creating something. And the final way that I really like this notion of the virtual beauty shop as a metaphor for us is through the notion of the enclave. Habermas writes years and years ago, right, about our public sphere. And since then, scholars have been doing their best to tear this notion to pieces. And I won't say it that way, but a little bit, they've torn it to pieces. Right? Nancy Fraser first pushes back against this and says that a public sphere is all well and good, but women aren't included in Habermas's idea of the public sphere. The problem is, in your ideas of these public democratic spaces, there have always been what she calls subaltern counterpublics who were doing this work separately. But what I love is Catherine Squire's work, who says, yes, counterpublics exist, but also what Black communities have found is that there are reasons sometimes to not form counterpublics, but to form what are called enclaves or satellites, places that are intentionally separate from the dominant group, right? They're keeping the discourse hidden. And there are reasons to do that in order to validate one's own sense of being, in order to create a sense of community, in order to strategize. And what's exactly what we find in the discursive practice of the beauty shop, that there's a different way of communing and being in conversation with folks who are like us, where we don't have to explain our hair. We don't have to apologize for our hair, right? And the same thing that happens online. These ways of knowing, of high context that's required for participation, the validation of our emotion, of our ideas, of our way of interacting, right? And so that's why I really love this idea of the beauty shop as a way for us to think through the broader ideas of how Black women engage online. And I'll just really briefly, because I know there's some graduate students here who are like, and what's the theory here? How are we building theory with this? I'll give you just these three pieces of it, right? And these three pieces of how we build this Black feminist technoculture come from the work of three women whose work I adore. The first is Patricia Hill Collins in The Matrix of Domination, who reminds us in a time where the term intersectionality has been taken up in a plethora of ways, that in fact, we are dealing with what is called a matrix of domination, an environment in which oppression develops, where inequality is structured, and where the complicated systems surround the lives of Black women every day. I like this terminology of matrix of domination because it reminds us of matrices, wherein multiple elements are not always immediately visible, though they are interconnected and reliant on each other to make sense of this larger whole, right? I combine then this idea of the matrix of domination, which surrounds the lives of Black women, with what Joan Morgan provides us in her book, When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost, which to this day is one of my, baby feminist texts that I read when I was in undergrad and loved, because it gives us two ideas. It gives us this notion of hip hop feminism, which is this complicated, messy relationship that Black women have with feminism that allows us to say things like, I love hip hop, but recognize the misogyny present in it, that these two things aren't in contradiction in my life, that they live side by side. And her dealing with hip hop feminism gives us a roadmap to deal with what's going on in digital space, which is Black women who are using digital platforms to make money, to live socially, to be romantic, to go to school, to do all of these things that are empowering, that are agentic, while also experiencing the worst of the harassment and violence that the internet has to offer in those very same spaces. And so that roadmap of hip hop feminism gives us space to deal with the messy, complicated relationship with the digital that is both things at once. It is harmful and helpful. It is saving and hurting. It is violent, and it is beauty and joy. And that it's not that we have to deal with that. It's that Black feminists have found ways to enjoy the messy, complicated grayness of that doesn't live in this separate world of Black and white. And the final part of the foundation of this text is Anna Everett's Black technophilia, which is way before its time, right? Anna Everett is writing about redirecting a public from an obsession with Black deviance in technology use, from a notion of technophobia, that Black folks need to be saved from themselves because we just don't get how to use these tools, to the idea that Black folks are technophilic. We are vanguards. We are the folks that everyone follows. Andre Brock calls this a natural affinity. Ray Fouché says that it is Black vernacular technological creativity. They have prettier words than I do for this, but I love their words because it allows us to re-examine Black women's relationship with technology without deficiency or deviance being the premise. And if we don't start there, if we start outside of that, our possibilities are so much bigger. What we can think about, what kinds of questions we can ask are so much more interesting if we aren't trying to solve a problem of Black women. If instead we are the solution to the problem, we are more than magic, we are skillful, and we are experts. So that is kind of the foundation, or what I would call the past view of how I was constructing what we could think of in this digital Black feminist realm. I told you I was going to give you a really truncated view of this talk, which sometimes goes on to talk about two other things, which I'll do in super brief form without the slides attached. I'll just talk really briefly about how to do this study of digital Black feminism, which I think is important and that I don't talk as much about in the book. But I think to do this study of digital Black feminism, we have to think about the methods that are necessary and where we go to find examples that we want to study. You'll notice in the reading of this text that I move between archival work and present social media spaces. And what I try to bring to those spaces are actually similar methods, are methods that weave between the two, that are seemingly desperate things, right? How are you looking at a correspondence from Anna Julia Cooper in 1905 in the same way that you're looking at Lovia Jay's post on Instagram stories? And I would say you're not looking at them the same way, but you can bring the same lens. You can bring the same commitments to both of those spaces. One of those commitments is that we see people in their fullness, that we treat the folks who we are writing about as full, whole humans and not as texts that have been left behind for us to mine for data. We also treat what they're doing in the kind of particular ways that they're doing it with respect. Meaning when I go to an archive, a wonderful archivist has already determined that some of the texts I'm reading from Anna Julia Cooper, as an example, are correspondence, while some of them are her public talks, while some of them are her memories and diaries. And I treat those things differently based on how they've labeled the different ways they interact. Too often as digital scholars, we come to a social media space and we treat all the texts in that space the same way. They're all tweets, they're all public. But what we know if we spend time with the humans that make those tweets is that humans are doing different things at different moments online. That sometimes my tweets are public an announcement to the world, right? This great thing happened, come to this talk. Sometimes my tweets are shady and they're only meant for a few folks who are gonna understand them. They're meant for my friend group. And I didn't do anything different to my tweet. I didn't put a block on it. I didn't say no one could read it. And so how would someone know that? Well, they might know that if they followed me and they followed me closely and they got to know me and they got to understand how my tone shifts or how I change my manner of speech based on what I'm saying and who I'm saying it to. And so we have to really be attentive to how we do it. If we're going to study Black feminism, we need to study it with a Black feminist epistemology that treats the Black women that we're studying as full people who are deserving of that kind of care and attention. So I just conclude that section by saying we have to form a relationship with this notion of capture, which means we have to be attentive to what we are capturing, how we are capturing it, what happens to the people and the words that are captured, and how we take ownership of our position as someone doing the capturing. The last piece that I'll say is about future, right? If that was our present moment, I will talk about what do we do next? How do we take this ethic of care forward into considering what possibilities exist for a digital Black feminist future? I give one example in the text that I think is resonant for folks, which is a video called Intersectionality Pizza. And this video called Intersectionality Pizza was created by a comedian named Akilah Hughes in 2015, where she was taking this term intersectionality and trying to make it palatable, trying to make it understandable for a broad audience. And she made what I think is a pretty funny video about how we can treat intersectionality, the idea, like pizza, by saying that some women are like cheese pizzas and some women are like deluxe pizzas. They've got more toppings, they have more going on, right? And men are kind of like burgers, right? And she does this kind of funny back and forth with the audience, and it works well, this short video, because one, it's short, two, it's funny, and three, what she's talking about, systemic racism, patriarchy, she doesn't name in those words. And so it is more, people are more willing to take that packaging of complex theory in that bite-sized chunk that isn't quite so offensive. And we have a tendency or a desire sometimes to take the very complex work that we're doing toward dismantling these systems and utilize the digital possibilities for going viral, for getting more people to see our work, for getting more access, for making them in interesting ways. And I think there's a desire on the part of those of us who teach that might be really attractive for our students. And the warning, if you would call it that I give is that, buzzwords and viral videos can help, but they can't do the in-depth critical analysis. And as a medium of mass communication, digital platforms can package these ideas of Black feminism for sale, but that process of commodification often provides what I would deem some superficial access to complex theory that culminates ultimately in a watered down product. So what's more challenging for me with this process of commodification is it's not just that it's stopped with our terms and our thoughts, but when commodification goes to commodifying actual human people, right? So when we have to be cautious as folks who are interested in Black feminist thought, that we're not actively engaging in this same process of commodifying other Black women as a part of our exploration of Black feminism online and digital Black feminism. And I think that that's probably a good enough place for me to wrap this up and just say that, this text allowed me to work through a lot of ideas I've been thinking about since graduate school. It's allowed me to watch the people that I was reading in the blogosphere while I was in grad school grow up and get their own New York Times columns and book deals and all of those things. And there's something intensely gratifying about watching folks who are very deserving get access to the stuff that they want. There's also something really scary about watching the things that you love be taken up by the dominant group and used in ways that no one intended them to be. And so this book gave me a place to kind of work through some of those mixed feelings. And I hope it gives folks a way to take up and do the critical historical work that is contextually relevant for what they're studying. And I'm very excited to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you for this book overview. I want to start our conversation here. I think our audience is a little bit shy now, but I can start our conversation with a question and we can warm up a little bit for the audience. Your presentation was very powerful too. So I'm writing down everything, but okay. But you say in the book and here at your presentation that the problem is not Black women's lack of skill in technology.
Right.
Yeah. You start the introduction saying for Black girls who don't code.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And you say that teaching how to use technology, code, and everything is not enough, and it's not a problem. The change is in the structure because people of color can enter. I was thinking about can enter at violent systems and suffer the same violence against their own bodies and subjectivity. Like, I don't know the expression in English, but the one and only syndrome, you know? I'm the only one
Yes.
here.
Yes.
What can I do?
Right. Right.
Is the book a call for changing the thinking about the problem, like shift the way of looking at the issue of Black women and technology? Because it seems, and you said that the solution to everything is to teach sometimes coding. One of the things I hear most when we are talking about algorithms bias, for example, is we need to understand how to build algorithms and then criticize them. You
Yeah.
know, don't
Yeah.
we already know their impacts without having to know how to code? Don't we already know how to use them to
Yeah.
trace escape routes without having to code? Can you talk a little bit more about this claim of the book?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. You know, to my core, I'm a mass communication scholar, and I am always thinking about frames and thinking about how problems are framed by media texts, by speakers, and how we frame a problem having so much to do with the potential solutions that we end up offering to it, whether that's in the news, right, or through a politician's speech, or in our books and literature, right? The way we talk about what a problem is can be incredibly limiting to the kinds of solutions that we see for it. And so organizations like Black Girls Code and the plethora of organizations that work to provide access and possibilities to Black girls, to other folks, there's nothing wrong with these organizations, right? They are doing something that there is at least a desire for in some spaces. And I applaud the energy and the efforts that go into those kinds of conversations. But what I also have witnessed, particularly in the US, in urban spaces that are dominated by Black and brown folks, is an over desire to solve the issues of those spaces through an overemphasis on STEM education, science, technology, engineering, math education, right? And this focus on tech learning as the future for this population. But what it presupposes when we suggest that folks in these spaces particularly need to learn these and need to spend extra hours. So my partner is a teacher, and they get double math periods, you know, in the Black and brown areas, right? Like, forget the reading, math, double science, right? It suggests that those skills don't exist in our communities, that is the problem, that either through lack of energy or effort, Black folks just haven't attended to these things. And it just, you know, it didn't sit right with me. And when things don't sit right, I do a lot more reading about it. And the history of both what we would consider traditional technology, the screens and the buttons and the computers, but also a broader notion of what technology is, seem to all have at their base folks who have been enslaved in this country, folks whose ancestors were brought here not because they were unskilled, but because they were so skilled that they could build the economic structure of a nation. And I think that reframing, because we've been taught about ourselves that, you know, our ancestors who were enslaved were not smart, they were not skillful, they were doing low understanding work, right? And that sticks with folks over the long term, that idea that we were not capable, that we were living in ways that were beneath and we were brought to. But it's just not supported by the facts. You would not continue to kidnap and hold hostage people to do labor who were bad at stuff. You would bring them because you needed their skillful expertise as it related to domestic work, to agricultural work, to artisanship, to building, to architecture. That's why you enslave. That's why you kidnap, right? That's why you hold hostage. And so that reframing, that historical reframing, gave me a place to really think about the present for Black women and to think about where are the spaces now where we're being told that we're not capable, where we don't have the skill sets. And I think your point is so strong, which is we understand, people who don't code understand how algorithms work. They manipulate the algorithms. And I mean, so my most recent work on Twitter, I think, is a great example of this, is that folks on Twitter were figuring out this algorithm in ways that were really brilliant, right? Like how to get their dances to go to the places they wanted people to see them, and then subsequently how to keep them out of the places that they didn't want people to see them so that they wouldn't take them up, wouldn't appropriate them, wouldn't make more money, right? They were understanding how to feed this algorithm information in order to get certain videos and block other videos. That's the kind of knowledge that I think is underestimated, under-discussed when we suggest that in order to have a conversation about ethics online, or to have a conversation about content moderation or algorithms, you have to build them, right? You have to make the app, you have to do those things. I just don't think it's true. Can you have fruitful conversations when you do those things? Yes. But it certainly seems to me that we can have really productive conversations even without that particular training.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, we have like students of yours, like here, Amanda Correia. This is a freshman at the University of Maryland, watching you, and she is
so.
wondering if
I'm
you'll be able to take her. It's very good.
Yeah, I'm teaching a media theory course in the fall. I hope to see you soon.
Very good. I have another question, like continuing this debate, because Patricia Hill Collins, that is a very important reference for you and for us here in Brazil. And in the book, she is very present. And you acknowledge that concept in your book, the outsiders within.
Yeah.
Because Patricia Hill Collins says that Black women are outsiders within, and because of that, they can see beyond and deeper, especially in white spaces.
Yes.
Do you think that in a certain way, Black women are also outsiders within in technology? Like, because we use the digital technology, but the digital technology is not made for us.
Correct.
So the magic is the creation of deep possibilities in that space, and the creation of our own technologies.
I hesitate to even answer because you put it so beautifully already. But I think that's precisely it. And I say in the book that I study Black women not out of some altruistic, oh, no one studied Black women, you've got to make something about Black women too. No, I really genuinely believe that the most fruitful conversation we can have about technology is about how folks use technologies that they weren't, when it wasn't designed for them. I think that when you look at any technology and who it was designed for, they use it the way they're supposed to. And how boring. But if we look at technologies and we look at who was kept from them, who was intentionally written, laws were written to keep people from, right? So this is why I find Black literature fascinating, right? When we talk about like folks who were intentionally had literacy laws that prevented them from writing and yet wrote these beautiful novels, that's a little more fascinating to me than folks who had access to the pen and paper for generations. And likewise with technology, the outsider within concept works so well there when we think about how Black women have been intentionally kept out of the design spaces, the thought spaces about how these tools would be created, and yet end up becoming the folks that everyone looks to understand how to best use them. Because when you're kept from something, you must understand it better than everyone else, right? And that is true about race. I think that is true about sex. I think that is true about digital technologies. When it's not designed for you, or when it is designed to keep you in a lower status, and some of these tools we have to be clear about were designed with Black folks in mind, but in order to keep Black folks in positions of subordination. And if that's the case, then it is incumbent upon you for your survival to understand how they work. So when Black women are receiving the heights of harassment and violence in Twitter, then we have to understand how Twitter works. We have to understand who can see our pages and how they come to see them, and how the algorithm functions to bring these folks in, and what we can do to keep them out, and how content moderation should work, and how privacy functions should work. We've got to get it. But if those things aren't happening to you, if those spaces were designed in ways that ignored, that didn't ignore your needs, that didn't ignore the things that could potentially happen to you, then you don't actually navigate them as well. You don't actually spend the time trying to parse through them. And so I think it's a beautiful way of putting it. That outsider within concept is so wonderful from Patricia Hill Collins, and gives us such a really generative way to think about race, gender, and also technology.
Yeah, we have a question here from Andre Lemos. Andre Lemos is a huge researcher here in cyberculture. He says, thank you, I haven't read your book yet. What do you mean by digital when you talk about digital Black feminism? Is it the same in the global South and in the global North? I think it's the major discussion here in Brazil with like post-colonial thinking and everything. What do you think?
So, I mean, I think there's a short answer to that, and there's a much longer answer. The short answer is no. That very intentionally, when I was writing this book, I'll put it the way that colloquially I would say it. I'm not trying to do too much. I am trying to stay in my lane, and I think it's important that we do that. I think it's important that first we write historically and contextually about a space, and then we recognize the intersections and overlaps that those spaces have. And so I've had some really great conversations with folks in Britain, for example, about Black women in Britain, and their question being like, don't you think this book is really about like Black women in Britain too? I was like, I hope you find those extensions. I hope that there are places, particularly as it relates to method, particularly as it relates to context, that you can say, I can take this and I can do this with this here. But I think context is so deeply important and significant. The thing about white supremacy is that it is global, right? And the thing about patriarchy is that we experience that across the globe. But the particularities of Black women's experience in the US are based on a US context. It is based on folks who were kidnapped and brought to those United States during a particular historical moment and for particular economic reasons, and that race developed in very particular ways in that space. And so those are the particularities that I try to unpack in the book. But all that said, I just had a wonderful conversation with an undergraduate student when I was giving a talk a few weeks ago, who was like, but she was from Nigeria. And she said, like, this doesn't apply because, like, we didn't have enslavement here in that way that you did in the US. And I said, oh, but this thing called imperialism and this thing called colonialism have so many woven parts where they merge together and they look similar. And so what I hope we do as we talk about the global North and the global South is we find ways that certain mechanisms function similarly to achieve certain goals in various places. Even though that might mean that the history and the context shift. So hopefully what you find in the text as you read it is that there are places where you can take up some of the discussion and find it more contextually useful to address it in different ways, or to look at different contexts or different texts in order to think through those ideas.
Yeah, but I think Brazil and US are very similar in that context. So we have a lot of similarities. Yeah. I think the majority of your book is talking about Brazil too. So we can understand which digital Black feminism you're talking about, because when you say, can I go on with the questions, because I think it's the continuing this debate, because when you say about virtual beauty shop,
yes,
the virtual beauty shop metaphor, it's so powerful for us here too, because when I read it about it, and I thought about the concept of quilombo here in Brazil, which were gathering spaces named here for enslaved Black people, a place of resistance, of sharing, of political practice as well. But beauty shop is a very common place here for resistance. But it's the same that you were talking about. It's awesome because puts women's practice at the center.
That's right.
So it is clear that it is a practice empowered by Black women. As you say, you say in comparison with barber shops.
Right.
So I'm thinking about Quilombo here.
Yeah.
And I love this metaphor because it's like you say, it's a place that that's a place of resistance, but it's also a place of we know our space, and
Yes.
now we know how to be safe here. And
Right.
it's not just about resistance. It's
That's right.
about being with our people.
That's right. And
How
I
to get to this metaphor?
oh,
Was
so this is, I wrote my dissertation on the digital barbershop, right? I was writing about the Black blogosphere, circa 2009, 2010, and thinking about how these online spaces were replicating offline spaces that didn't exist as much as they used to. So what we found here is that a lot of Black folks who go off to college, get decent paying jobs, end up having to either spend all day at work away from other Black folks, right? Or move away from Black community, Black neighborhoods in the way that they used to exist. And barbershops used to have such a important role within Black communities, not only as spaces where Black folks gathered and got their haircut, but as you said, a place where no one else was in charge and they didn't even look at it. They didn't even pay attention to it. And there is something very, dare I say, magical about spaces that are outside of the watchful eye of the dominant group, where really important, as you said, resistance can happen, but also where freedom can happen, where freedom from the gaze can happen, where conversations that wouldn't happen elsewhere could happen, where people can really think through ideas deeply. And I was making the connection to the blogosphere as a place that was really replicating that. And I was doing it at a time where people were really into talking about Twitter. And I didn't want to write about Twitter. I wanted to write about the blogosphere because there was something that could happen in those spaces that I called enclaves that couldn't happen on Twitter where everyone was watching. The blogs were these spaces where it was kind of hard to find them unless you knew they existed, and where there were long posts. So these long posts were kind of hard to troll. Nobody was coming in to like say negative things about the bloggers. It was genuinely a community of people who wanted to be in conversation with each other. And so I wrote the dissertation on the digital barbershop, but I had this realization at the end of the dissertation writing process that the reason I wanted to write about this space altogether, the blogosphere altogether, was because of the Black women who were running these blogs. And yet I was naming my dissertation barbershop. I was using that cultural reference point because I thought other people would get that better, right? Like there are movies about barbershops. There's all this like, popular culture reference to Black barbershops. And so I had this notion that like people would get that. They would understand that reference point. But I was doing the same thing that I'm constantly arguing against. Was I was erasing the Black women that were at the center of what was happening online. And so I made this kind of commitment that when I wrote my first book, I would not turn my dissertation into the book project. I would write about the Black women at the center of it. And I think the metaphor, what's great about a good metaphor is that it keeps surprising you with ways that the connections can happen. Because when I began, I didn't have all of these different connections. I was like, oh, it's kind of like a beauty shop because, people gather and they're doing their hair just the same way that they would write. And then it's like, no, but they also are creating these brands and these businesses. And they're also like shifting dialogue around important topics. And they're also dealing with things like colorism. And they're also dealing with things like the white gaze from afar and why, certain hair practices connect to white supremacy. Like all of those things are happening in this digital space. So there were so many, ways that this kind of moved between the two that it became this really powerful metaphor for me. And I thought that it would be a useful one for lots of reasons, as you just mentioned, because it may not always be a beauty shop everywhere. But what we know about doubly and triply marginalized groups is that we find a space, and we find a space that's our own until someone finds it. And then we find a new space. And that's what I can be very sure of in terms of translating this work globally, is that folks have always found a space. And they've always used that space to both do the resistance work and to just be, to just live freely, to practice joy. Because I try to write, as much as I write about resistance, I try to write about joy. And joy, yes, as a resistance strategy, but also joy for the sake of joy. Pleasure for the sake of pleasure is probably the ultimate way that we can track folks' freedom, right? If we begin to exist for ourselves and not in response to someone else.
Great. When you say about joy, I think dialogues a lot with Laura. Here, there is Laura is a major researcher here about race and intersectionality. She says, "Thank you for the talk, Catherine. You mentioned humor. How can humor help us in anti-racist struggles?"
Thank you for this question. I point always to the work of Dr. Sarah Florini and Andre Brock, who were some of the first folks to write about Black signifying practices online, generations, centuries old practices that traveled from West Africa to all over the Americas, of things like playing the dozens, of the kinds of jokes and intercommunal contextual ways of humor that are sustaining for communities. And they write about how certain platforms really bend themselves toward that kind of humor. It's almost as though they were designed, and they weren't, right? But it's almost as though they were designed for this. And this is why Florini and others argue that Black folks have had such a monopoly on places like Twitter, because we get it. We get how to do the humor of those spaces. We get how to turn those spaces into the back and forth, the call and response, all of these kind of oral cultural practices that traverse the ocean, right? That were recommitted in various new cultural ways across the Americas. And so I think humor has a deeply impactful way. And I point to, and you mentioned an essay that I just published about Zora Neale Hurston. She wrote an essay in 1934 called "The Characteristics of Negro Expression." I remember reading it my sophomore year of undergrad, and I was fascinated by this essay, and I never had the chance to write about it. And so when I finished the book, I was like, I'm going to write about this. And it was really an essay that pointed toward ways that Black folks were expressing themselves through things like humor and dance and joy, publicly, but not performatively. And I think that really is the key, or the help in thinking about anti-racism, is that it's not a performance of happiness or humor meant for the gaze of someone else, but it's almost in spite of the fact that others are watching. Because what Black folks in the States and across the globe know is that someone's always watching, right? Blackness is a life lived under surveillance in so many ways. And so there is an acceptance in public humor that folks will watch, but I don't care if they get it. And I think that there is a real power to the ability to do that in digital spaces, that can be transformative. I do see the other question about Afro-pessimist feelings about technology, and I didn't do a big section on Afro-pessimism, and the only reason I have is that I just didn't want to in the text, because it could have taken over in ways that I was trying to be mindful that it didn't in this particular work. But the point about misogyny, I think, is really relevant and really important, because I think that what digital Black feminism has the possibilities of doing is both accepting the existence of misogynoir whilst understanding the wider complexity of Black experience that is not done in relationship to misogynoir and racism. And I know that sometimes is a controversial statement, but Andre Brock says this often in talks. He's like, my life day to day, I don't spend thinking about white folks. And I always think that that's a really powerful statement about what he writes about in his book, Distributed Blackness, which is that obviously racism and white supremacy undergird our lives. Obviously patriarchy undergirds our lives, but we also do things for the sake of pleasure, as humans, as full humans. And if no one's writing about that, then the story that's told about Blackness is one only of deviance, of deficiency, of violence, of hatred. And that is not the life that we're living. That is not the life that each of us inhabits. And when we look back at folks who are experiencing the most brutal of our systems of oppression, they were also getting married, having babies, having dances, making food for each other, caring for one another. They were living full lives. And I think that there is a disservice that we offer when we don't then one, mark that history, but also we bring that notion into the present that we are not capable of living those full lives as well. That's why I like studying like hair blogs and mommy blogs and all those spaces, right? Because that's where resistance strategies happen, but it's also where we live out our more full experience as well.
Yeah. Luciana, we have a lot of great researchers here in Brazil watching you. Dr. Steele, thank you for sharing your research with us. I would like to hear more about the connection with hip hop feminism. It's a powerful concept too, and how Black women's strategies for navigating this arena.
Hip hop feminism was such a powerful like motivator for me in writing this, because the coming my like Black feminist coming of age, I think, was happening in the best moments of hip hop feminist publishing, right? And so I point to Joan Morgan in the text, Treva Lindsay. There's lots of folks who are Brittany Cooper, who do a really great so Crunk Feminist Collective, right? All of these folks are publishing about and using hip hop really as a way of suggesting that we require a more complex feminism than we had been offered previously. That an essentializing feminism that requires us to divorce our joy from our activism is not palatable. That there is an experience of not only living in, but finding comfort in enjoying the grayness, the non-Black and white, the non-binary of our existence, which means that sometimes we're going to like some problematic stuff. Like sometimes the beat on problematic stuff goes really hard and we like it. But also that stuff is not extra. It's integrative to who we are, right? Like our culture deeply matters to who we are as Black women. And so to ask us to not be a part of the cultural experience of hip hop just wasn't realistic. And so what I think Joan Morgan and other folks offer is this way of suggesting that the gray is actually the deeply theoretical work, that it's not like me giving up on feminism or being a bad feminist. It is me actually making the feminism more complex, asking more questions about it, pushing it further. And I think what hip hop feminism did for me in the writing of this book was give me the space to think about how a generation's relationship with hip hop changed their feminism. And so I wanted to write about how a generation's relationship with digital culture has changed their feminism, right? It really has changed our notion of capitalism and agency. It's really changed our notion of our relationship to community and self. It's really changed our ideas about how we identify and how we force that identification or require others to name us in the way that we choose. A lot of that stuff originates or is reified by digital culture, right? Creating avatars for ourselves and setting up our own blogs and changing our screen names and managing our online brand identity. These aren't things that you can do. These are things we're required to do to exist right now, right? Like my students have brands of themselves online, right? When they post on Instagram, they are posting to their branded content. And that matters with how they encounter feminism. It changes what we need feminism to do for us. It changes our commitments. It changes our allegiances, right? Which means that sometimes we are in allegiance with folks that other people would look at as not feminist, as not feminist enough, as not committed to anti-racist practice, as not anti-capitalist enough, right? And so I write about this with our dearly departed Bell Hooks in the book, and her relationship with figures like Beyonce, and her conversation with actors and activist Laverne Cox, and how that generational kind of conversation really opens up our vision of how digital culture has changed Black feminism. I think for good, right? Until something else takes up that mantle. But to the question's point, hip hop feminism gave us the guidepost for that. They showed us so well how that relationship with hip hop would change Black feminism forever.
Yeah, when you say about Beyonce and Bell Hooks, it was a very important part of your book, because you talk a lot about generational conflict.
Yeah.
And I think We have here the same discussion in Brazil because I think the new generation are presenting another way of activism and political activity, not only in the ways our mothers and grandmothers did in other times, you say. Some people say that if you are only on in the internet or fighting for good representation in TV shows like Big Brother, in Twitter, Instagram, for example, this is not political activity.
Right.
So you have to do the traditional battle, go to the streets.
Right.
So your book shows how this is also a very powerful way of political action.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Like blogging can be also a way of change.
Yeah.
Change.
Ultimately, what I hope to do with the book was mark a shift. To not say the shift was good, the shift was bad, the shift was, was the wave of the future and everybody should be doing what these women in the book are doing. But it did seem important enough that we mark that something different is happening right now, because it's not going to be this way forever. Just like we see with hip hop feminism, like that these things change as our cultural experience changes, and that digital technology changes so quickly that these moments in the blogosphere and 2010 that I'm writing about are so distant for students who weren't who are a little bit younger than me, right? Like that they're like blogging, and so it seemed important to me to mark the shift and to say that even if the technologies that we're writing about right now do not exist in 10 years, what will exist are the kinds of relationships that people form with those technologies. Those are long lasting because new technologies will form. But what we need the tech to do for us, how we manipulate technology, our histories, they keep cycling, right? And so if we look at this as a long history of folks with technology, then we see how things come up again and again, how certain requirements, certain affordances, certain desires come up again and again, how certain blockages come up again and again. And that is the hope that I have with this text, is that it's someone asked me, are you going to write a part 2 to this? I was like, I will not, but it will be written, right? That someone in 10, 15 years will say, Twitter, what, Instagram, who, and then they will take these technologies that they are dealing with, that they are experiencing, these cultural shifts, and they will think through how the relationship with revolutionary feminist thought is impacted by folks' relationship with those tools.
So I think I can continue that dialogue because I wrote down here a very powerful phrase of your book about this conflict, this generational conflict. You say it's about claiming agency, like digital Black feminists.
Yeah.
It's about claiming agency over themselves and their bodies, regardless of who is seeing. Mm-hmm. Can you explain this assumption?
So, folks have been writing about Black women, about women's relationship with agency, about a feminist relationship with agency for some years. What I noticed about digital Black feminists is this idea that the reclamation of the right to be either sexually or financially agentic in our choices has become not just like a preferred status, but instead a deeply connected part of their feminist praxis, right? That the ability to say, for example, in a Beyonce video, right, which I think is one of the examples I use in the text, that this is happening in front of you all. I don't care what you think of it, that you're going to do with my body what you will anyway. So there's a recognition in this form of agency that it is limited, that I can do some things with my body. I know you're going to do what you want to do regardless of what I do. So I'm going to do what I wish to do with my body anyway. I was just fortunate to sit on Aria Holiday's has a new book called Buy Black that just came out. And I was fortunate yesterday to be on a call discussing her new book, where she uses Nicki Minaj, the artist, as an exemplar of this, of thinking about how she takes control over her sexual imagery. And the point we came to was that was really interesting about Minaj and other artists was she does all this while knowing what's going to happen to this video once it goes online, right? Like there's only this brief moment where she's in control of this fully, right? Where she makes the creative decisions about what the video is going to look like and what's going to be on her body and how it's going to be marketed, knowing full well that once it's released, the memes and the responses, she has no control of anymore. So I think agency is this really interesting thing for digital Black feminists, because I think for some of a different generation, there's this idea that they're unaware. Oh, these naive children who think that they're in charge of their words or their bodies. But to be deeply embedded in a digital culture is to know that you have no control over things once you let them off of your computer, once you hit send, right? And so we can't pretend that these folks are naive or unaware or unassuming about what's going to happen, but they're choosing to do it anyway. And so since they're choosing to do it anyway, then that really matters that we pay attention to the why of that and the how of that. I relate this to historically how Black women have navigated other kinds of ideological things that people have said aren't helpful, like the notion of respectability, right? And respectability being this performance of being a respectable Black person after slavery so as to gain favor, citizenship, access, and this performance of being a good Black person, right? And for good reason, folks have been deeply critical of this idea of respectability. But what I think respectability also teaches us is that Black folks can be aware that that's not going to work and still engage in it as a way to undermine the system, right? Like the Black women who were touting respectability were full on aware that they were not going to somehow now be treated like white women. But what performance of respectability did was strip the ability of racist folks to use that as a reason to withhold rights, to use respectability as a reason, right? So it strips it bare to its bare logic, which says, no, if you're going to treat me this way, if you're going to withhold my rights, you're going to have to do it purely on the basis, you're going to have to say it out loud that it is about me being Black. You can't put it on the fact that I don't know how to use a fork or wear a petticoat, right? You're going to have to just say it's about race. We're going to have to make that plain. And I think agency does similar work online. I think that agency traffics in a neoliberal, fully hyper-capitalist moment. But I think it does so with full knowledge of what it's doing.
Great, very good. Messias, José Carlos Messias, it's a huge success, your lecture today. He says, great talk, congratulations, Dr. Steele. I will definitely add your book to my syllabus. I had a question about anti-capitalism and refusal versus negotiation. But I think you just answered, but I think I want to add to this question about anti-capitalism and refusal and negotiation, because you have, it's another awesome thought in the book, is Black feminism online as a product, as a business model. This touches on conflicting issues regarding Black identity. It seems that whenever we are talking about product consumption, capitalism, we are moving away from racial authenticity. And you show that, no, although there are problems in treating Black feminism as a product for others, there are strategies used by Black women to survive and resist in the system of consumption, as you say. And you say beautifully, Black womanhood has always been profitable for someone. Digital Black feminism now shows how Black women's labor and thought can now be profitable for Black women. Can you say more about this way of thinking? How can we see Black feminism online as a product? I think dialogues with Messias, with like this anti-capitalism and negotiation, with our racial authenticity and identity.
Yeah, the last kind of substantive chapter in the book really talks about this notion of product, right? And what does it mean to turn Black feminism into a product for sale, a commodity, something that can be bought and sold. And I do begin with this idea that like, well, Black women and Black stuff is always sold, right? That there's no question about that. Black humans are sold, right? And so someone has found profit in that. What I'm always interested in as we think about, and I believe, as Bell Hooks said, that Black feminism must be anti-capitalist because capitalism is deeply linked to patriarchy and white supremacy, that we can't pull those things apart fully. But I think also what Black feminism has always been is deeply pragmatic. That Black women have found strategies to exist within systems whilst calling the system a fake, whilst pointing out how deeply problematic the system is at its core, but also finding ways to exist within it. And we see examples of this in politics. We see examples of this in the way that we teach. We see examples of this in a plethora of ways, pop culture, representation, like everywhere. We see examples of Black women who know full well that the system was not created for us, that the intention is not for us to survive it, but have learned to navigate it in ways that are useful for ourselves, for our children, for our communities, right? And I think that this is another example of that within this notion of Black feminism as product, I am deeply skeptical and somewhat worried about letting go of the anti-capitalist notions of Black feminism. But I also am heartened by the way that digital Black feminists have continued to push for transformative politics, transformative justice within a capitalist system. And what it reminds me is that we aren't magic, that we are human beings who live within the systems we're in. But we're often held to expectations that are different than the folks that are oppressing us. That we are supposed to be deeply anti-capitalist within a capitalist system, meaning we're supposed to go hungry. We're supposed to not pay our bills. We're supposed to sacrifice these things in pursuit of a more noble goal. And it's not realistic, right? Because we are deeply human as well. And so I think that there are these unanswered questions. There are these things that are in conflict about this notion of commodity. There are things that are really worrisome, like this intersectionality pizza, right? Really worrisome ways that our tools, that our ideas get taken up and get destroyed on purpose when they go public, when they go viral. But there's also, ways that folks are using tools online to do like transformative Black feminist pedagogy, right? Like they are actually doing the work of teaching in depth online on YouTube. And so we can't dismiss or discount that those things are also happening in these hyper-capitalist spaces. So what do we do with that? Do we throw it away? Do we suggest it's worthless, it's not valuable? Or do we make space for the gray, which is what hip hop feminism requires us to do? Do we make space for this grayness that is a both and instead of a versus, right? So can Black women participate both in refusal and in negotiation with the system? Yes, because they already are. So it's not even for me to theorize, right? Like I'm tracking it and both things are happening. There are ways that Black women are attending to notions of refusal. I will not participate in this thing. I will not allow myself, my personhood to be turned into commodity. And there's ways where Black women are like, except right here, except in this instance, because it's beneficial, either for me or for my community or some combination of the two. And so it's so messy. And I often say to my students, like, I am much more interested in the messiness than I am of things that are clear. Like there's no reason to do research on stuff that has clear answers, but like messy research, I think is actually more useful, more interesting. Places where we don't have like definitive answers of like, this is right, this is wrong, this is problematic or not. It's both at the same time. And I think digital Black feminism is both at the same time.
Great. I think we are going to the end of the presentation. That's a brilliant presentation, but I can ask you a little bit more about, because you say you like the messy research, and I think it's brilliant in your book because you claim for this complexity of the movement of the digital Black feminism. You claim for Cardi B as a prototype for digital Black feminism is very good, and Beyonce with bell hooks and distinction and everything, and I love it. And then you call for a critical view of digital Black feminism as well, not as if it were perfect and the salvation of the world. There are tensions, contradictions, important to recognize, but they don't reduce the power of the practice. Is that so?
That's right. That's right. I mean, it's the both and always for me. And I save that most critical chapter or segment for the end of the book for that reason, which was, this is not a book that is, I say it's a book about Black women. It's not a book that with blinders on, that doesn't recognize the accountability that's required for ourselves in this process as well. Because we can enter spaces where our practice or our notion of what it means to be a Black feminist, I use this with Cardi B, right, is to take up elements of other Black women's womanhood and try it on and perform it as a way to try out our feminism. And if we're doing that, if we are taking up the bodies and the likenesses of other Black women, if we are dehumanizing other Black women in our process of becoming a better feminist, what are we doing, right? And so we have to make space, I think, even in places where I felt deeply honored to study Black women. I feel deeply responsible in that study. But I also feel an obligation to keep us honest about what's happening and what the possible futures look like without intention, without like a real serious intent toward the hard work of revolutionary thought. Right. So it is definitely a both and situation. I hope and I trust that the folks that I write about understand that I write about them with care, with responsibility, but also with integrity and honesty, in ways that holds us all to a higher standard, myself included. And I'm always grateful when folks, hold me to that standard in the text and say, why did you do that? Or couldn't you have done more about this? Because I think that we have to live in that space if we want to change our societies.
Great, Catherine. So I think we have to finish here because of the time, but not before saying that your book will be very useful here in Brazil, Catherine. It was a desire of you to be useful. So it will be very useful. We are excited to read in our classrooms and research groups and labs and spread this debate that is so important. Are you thinking about another project right now that is in course, or is too soon?
No, I don't know how to be still. And so I do have a second book project under contract now. It's a much more practical book. It's called Doing Black Digital Humanities. And it is really a guide post for folks on how to do ethical practices in doing Black DH work. And I would love to come to Brazil, say less. But also there's another project I'm working on joy right now that's in the very, very early stages that I'm excited to explore more in depth next year.
Great. We have to book right now the presentation for this book.
I would love it. I would love it.
In Brazil, in presence.
I would love it. Yeah, I would love to do
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I hope you keep in touch to build a good and deep relationship between our studies and universities.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you to the audience. It was a pleasure.